Texted me this morning and said it's the Super Bowl of Great Salt Lake, which had me wondering if you could create a sports team with Great Salt Lake figures, who would you put on it? I want Wayne Wurtzbaugh as the coach, Laura Vernon. I want Rob Dubuque. Anybody else? Lynn, obviously. Yeah, other ideas? The dancing fall rope. A lot of good stuff. Yeah, definitely the fall rope, yep. Okay, cool. Well, thanks everybody for coming back in after lunch. We're gonna begin our round of afternoon talks, starting with Jim Bowcutt. So you can come on up here and take it away. Thank you.
Okay, it's great to be with you today. Looks like I need to watch what I say. I don't want to re-summon the dancing puller up here. But no, it's great to be here with you. When Lynn called me and said that she wanted me to present at this meeting, specifically on split season lease, and I said, well, here's where we're at, is we don't really even know what this looks like at this point. Just a little bit of background. It was December, I think, of last year, right before the legislative session. It was at the department Christmas party. I sat down across from Commissioner Butters and Kelly. We had been talking about ag water optimization. That was a big thing, you know, the projects that we're going to get, the money that we've got to put on the ground. And we hit the point, I mean, obviously Hannah, you know, it's always tough to follow Hannah, but the program was in good hands. And I sat down with Commissioner Butters and Kelly Pearson, the deputy commissioner, and I said, water leasing's the next thing. I was like, I feel like the ag water optimization has kind of got its direction. I feel like it's in good hands with Hannah Freeze. I said, we need to sit down within our department and we need to discuss what is water leasing, what are we okay with when it comes to water leasings? Is it something that we want to get on board with? Is it something that we don't want to support? As a card-carrying member of Farm Bureau, I can tell you that for a good long while, Farm Bureau was highly opposed to fallowing. And fallowing and leasing, there was a lot of discussion that took place as far as, is it something that the agricultural community could support? I told Lynn, I said, I don't know where we're going to be in 2 to 3 months when I agree to give this presentation. And I said, we may or may not have a direction forward, and I'm going to tell you right now, this presentation right now is going to be a presentation on what we don't know, what we want to know, what we need to know, and more or less it's going to give you our perspective from the Department of Agriculture and Food when we look at water leasing here in the state of Utah. So real quick, one of the things that they wanted us to talk a little bit about was, what are the definitions? What do we talk about when we're talking about leasing and fallowing? So the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, when it talks about fallowing, is usually cultivated land that is allowed to lie idle during the growing season, or the tilling of the land without sowing it for a season. One of the first things that we had to come to grips with at the Department of Agriculture and Food is leasing is not fallowing. You know, for so long they said, fallowing is the F word. And there are places across the United States that they utilize fallowing. And it's a practice that they have, and it's something that has proven to not have a real great impact on agriculture, on the environment. And so as we started down this road of water leasing, split season leasing, we just needed to make sure that we understood we're not talking about fallowing. What we're talking about is something completely different when it comes to leasing. So one of the first things that they started to talk to us about at the Department of Agriculture and Food was split seasonal leasing. And so in this one, the landowner irrigates their crops for a portion of the season and then allows the water right or share to be leased by another party for the remainder of the irrigation season. So Hannah talked to you a little bit about alfalfa, right? You can get 4, 5, if you're lucky, crops of alfalfa. And once you harvest the alfalfa, you usually try to get water back on the ground as fast as you can to get that alfalfa growing again. And so what they discussed with us to kind of, I guess it was like turning up the heat on a frog a little bit, I guess, to make us feel comfortable. Not that we're opposed to it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But they said, how would you feel about if you had these crops of alfalfa and you allowed that producer to irrigate the first 2 cuttings of alfalfa, and then after that, they just stopped irrigating the crop afterwards? That producer could still harvest the alfalfa that's growing in the field. Alfalfa grows really well in a dry land climate. I grew up in a little town called Beaver Dam in between Tremont and Utah. or Tremont and Logan, excuse me. And I say that because there's a beaver dam down in Nevada. And people always think that I'm from the beaver dam in Nevada, but it's beaver dam up there where it's between Tremont and Logan. And a lot of the alfalfa fields up there are dryland alfalfa fields. And right now, they're over knee high, and they've never been irrigated. So if you irrigate the first 2 cuttings of alfalfa, you're going to get a great first crop, you're going to get a great second crop, and you're probably, even if you stop irrigating, going to get a pretty good third crop, and maybe, if you're lucky, a phenomenal fourth crop in a situation like that. And we said, well, this is great. I think that this would work for us. I think we're open to doing a split seasonal leasing program. And so it moved on a little bit further, and they started to talk a little bit about seasonal leasing. Okay, so the difference between split seasonal leasing and seasonal leasing is the landowner agrees not to irrigate their crop for the duration of the irrigation season. They're just not going to apply irrigation water to that crop, thus making the water available to be leased by another interested party throughout the duration of the entire irrigation season. And at first, we were a little bit hesitant on this. We thought, I don't know that this is something that we want to be a party to. We don't know that we want to do it. However, as we sat down and we started to talk about it a little bit, we started to realize that we were open to it. But there had to be a few caveats that were included in this. So I guess Hannah did a pretty good job of telling the story of agriculture. And what we do at the Department of Agriculture and Food is we are basically the advocates for the agricultural community. I see that you guys are, you have a vested interest in the Great Salt Lake, and I respect that. I grew up hunting waterfowl. I grew up in Tremont. I grew up doing a lot of things on the edge of the Great Salt Lake. I've been part of Delta Waterfowl, Ducks Unlimited. To say that I'm passionate about the lake and what the lake is doing and interested in the lake is definitely not an understatement. But what I will say is we feel the same way at the Department of Agriculture and Food when it comes to agriculture. We see it as a valuable commodity. We see it as something that we need to treasure in the state of Utah, and we see it starting to slip away. So in 1960, since 1960, Utah has lost nearly 2.7 million acres. So roughly 20% of the farmland that was available for food production in the state of Utah has already disappeared. So with that being said, we said, well, we're willing to go down this road, but we feel like we need to look at a few additional things when we look at leasing and split season leasing here in the state of Utah. Some of the things that I wanted to point out when it comes to agriculture and why it's so important in the state of Utah. So we need to look at the economy. And if we start losing agriculture in the state of Utah, how is that going to impact the economy in the state of Utah? Right now, agriculture accounts for 211,000 jobs here in the state of Utah. There is $7 billion, that's billion with a B, of direct wages that are generated through the jobs that are present here in the state of Utah. The direct output of the goods that are produced equates to $27.9 billion. I think a lot of people, when they think about the agricultural commodity in the state of Utah, they think about the 2% of the population that makes up the agricultural community. But in all reality, it's so much more. You've got the farmers that are growing the crops. You've got the people that are harvesting the crops. You've got the people that are transporting the crops. You've got the people that are processing those crops. You've got the people that are selling those crops. It's a very big picture. And I think a lot of people fail to realize the impact that agriculture has here in the state of Utah. Another thing that a lot of people fail to mention is what agriculture means to wildlife here in the state of Utah. And this is something that I say on a regular basis. If you ever go up to Corinne or northern Utah and you look at the irrigated crop fields that are up there, you're going to see more white-faced ibises than you can shake a stick at. And they are dependent upon the flood irrigation practices that are taking place up there in northern Utah. As an avid waterfowl hunter, I can tell you right now that up in the Corinne area, there were more trumpeter swans on those agricultural fields than I have ever seen in my life. It provides a very valuable food source for wildlife as they pass through and they migrate down the corridor. Sandhill cranes, obviously, they're very dependent upon agriculture. You got your snow geese, your mallards, you've got other ducks, and I think the list could go on and on about all these birds that are actually dependent on the agricultural land. And so something that we always say on a regular basis is, we get and we understand that the wetlands are important, but we need to do research and we need to see what the impacts would be if we took all that agricultural land out of production? What impacts would that have? And I get it, we're not trying to take all the ag land out of production. We would never say that. We don't feel like it's being fully attacked. But we do need to understand what impacts it will have on the migratory birds and the flyway if we do that. Another thing, this was brought up a little bit by Hannah, and it was a question that was brought up as well, is agricultural production in the state of Utah. And this is probably one of the biggest things that when you talk to me and you say, what are you concerned about right now? What keeps you awake at night? It's our agricultural sustainability right now. It's food security in the state of Utah. So we talk a little bit about grain. Currently, we are able to provide in the state of Utah 90% of our grain needs for the state of Utah. Now, what this chart shows is in blue, the percent that we are self-sufficient today. What the red shows is the percent sufficient in 2050 as the population increases and the same amount of agricultural acres is in production, which we know is not happening. We're losing agriculture at a staggering rate. But right now, 95% of our grain, like Hannah mentioned, 134% of our protein production, so that's our beef, our lamb, things like that. Fruit, we provide 3% of the fruit needs for the population. So let's say that something like COVID hits right now. The supply chain's cut off. How long will it take for the shelves to go dry again and not have food for the population in the state of Utah? Right now, we've got 3% for fruit. Vegetables, we're at 2% currently. And dairy, we're at 26%. And so these numbers are pretty alarming to me. And I hear a lot of people say, well, why worry about agriculture? And I say, well, we're not always going to be able to get your watermelons from Mexico or California. We went through this exercise during COVID, and we need to start looking at how are we more self-sufficient in the state of Utah as far as that goes. Now, I realize there's other factors that come into play here. I do believe that there's probably potential to diversify crops. I think that there is a way to be able to do that. The problem that we've got, when I was growing up in northern Utah, up in Cache Valley, they had the Del Monte processing plant up there, and they were doing beans, they were doing sweet corn. They had to close shop because they just did not have enough acres. Even if we had producers that were willing to grow these other crops, we don't have that third party. We don't have the people in between the agricultural community and the consumer to be able to process that food like they have in other areas. So there's a lot of other things that go into account here, but ultimately the thing that we will not have that is a resource that if we lose it, it will never come back, that is the percentage of viable ag land in the state of Utah. Other potential impacts, reducing agricultural production, by reducing agricultural production, obviously there's decrease in air quality. I think that all of us are aware of what happened back in 1937 during the Dust Bowl when they decided that they were going to till up the Midwest and they were going to plant grain, and they were hit with drought, and you can see that picture up on top of the big dust storms that would take place. We understand that there are issues with the dust that comes up off of the Great Salt Lake. But do we want to transfer that problem to the Great Salt Lake to a bunch of fallowed fields that don't have vegetation growing on it north of the Great Salt Lake? And I think the answer there is no. And I think we can find ways around that as well. Decreased soil health. If you just till the land, you're going to lose your microbes that are within the soil. You're going to lose a lot of your organic content. It's just not going to be a great thing to happen. You're going to see increased temperature as well if you remove some of that vegetation. And then the other thing that kind of hits home to me, and maybe this is because I'm somebody that grew up in an agricultural community, is losing your identity. We get a lot of people moving here to the state of Utah, and it's not so that they can be a part of a concrete jungle. But it's so that they can be in the environment that we currently have. But in my neck of the woods, Garland, Utah, where I've lived for years and years, the big city celebration's called Wheat and Beet Days because it was focused around the harvest of the wheat and the beets during that August time frame. If you go up to Richmond, Utah, it's Black and White Days because of the black and white Holstein cattle that are up there. If you go to Brigham City, you've got Peach Days. Agriculture is who we are in the state of Utah. It may not be as much as it was before, but it's still something that we like to celebrate, and it's still something that I feel like is worth protecting. And then not to mention the farmers markets that I think a lot of us enjoy as well. some of the things that we did when we sat down, Commissioner Butters and Kelly and Hannah, we sat down in the room, we made a big list of what agricultural water leasing was and what it was not, and then we made a list of things of what we don't know about water leasing. There's a lot of things that we still need to figure out. Like I said, to date, we've had 2 meetings where we sat down with the Great Salt Lake the Commissioner's Office, the Division of Water Resources, the Department of Agriculture and Food to say, we think this is a viable option moving forward. Let's figure out what this is going to look like. Laura Vernon was there. We're definitely open to it in the agricultural community. We think it can work for the well-being of our agricultural producers, but there's still a lot of things that we don't understand, and there's still a lot of things that we don't know when it comes to talking about water leasing. And some of them are, who's going to determine the value of the leased water? And how is it going to be determined? When we talk about leasing that water, are you just going to charge the people for the value of that water? What is a water share in that irrigation company? Is that all you're going to be reimbursed for? Or do we need to look at what that landowner would have made had he planted his operation in a crop to be able to get him back to where he was financially if he were not to plant those crops? These are questions that we still need to answer. We need to figure out how these cost estimates are going to be done. Some of them, and this has come up before, and it came up in this meeting today, is how are you going to make sure that water gets shepherded to the Great Salt Lake if someone is to get that, to lease that water? So before my life at the Department of Agriculture and Food, I worked at the Division of Water Quality as an environmental scientist. And I remember I got a call up from somebody that was on an irrigation company in Cache Valley, and they said, we just piped our irrigation ditch, and we've got about 3 CFS that we could let go down the Logan River. Are you interested in leasing that to be able to delist the Logan River? Now, dilution's a solution to pollution, and a lot of the listings are based on concentration. And so I heard that and I said, heck yeah. Like if I can get an additional CFS to come down the Logan River, that is going to take care of a lot of the temperature impairments. It's going to take care of a lot of the phosphorus impairments. I said, how long down that river are you going to be able to leave that water to be able to delist that water body? And they said, well, until the next head gate. That's how long you're guaranteed. So I was like, so you want me to lease water from you, and you can only guarantee that it's going to be in the river from your head gate to the next guy's head gate? No thanks. Like I don't want to pay for that. And so that's one of the questions that we need to come up is if we have, individuals that are willing to lease their water, and this water's intent is to make it to the Great Salt Lake, how are we going to verify that that water is indeed going to make it to the Great Salt Lake? Another thing, and this came up too a little bit, are we willing to use taxpayer money in Idaho and Wyoming for leasing? We've got Utah taxpayers that are giving us this money. Are we willing to go and spend money and lease that water from people in Wyoming and Idaho? If we are going to get the water savings and get the water out of the agricultural community through the leasing program that they say we need in the lake, we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to go up into Idaho, and we're going to have to go up into Wyoming. So what is that going to look like? I don't think anybody knows what that is either. And then once again, how is this going to impact the agricultural water market? You have the agricultural community that this is their business, this is their livelihood, this is what they do. What do we do when we take all this taxpayer money and we put it in the water market, and all of a sudden we've outpriced the agricultural community to be able to afford water rights in the state of Utah to be able to grow their crops? We don't want to inflate the water market with taxpayer money. We want to make sure that there's an even playing field. How do we do that? I'm not sure. There's a lot of things that we still need to figure out. And when I called Tim Davis up, when I was getting ready to give this presentation, I said, what would you tell me to tell these people? And he said, tell them it's a work in progress. Tell them that there's a lot of things we don't know. And he said, I'm really interested to see what questions you get and how you're going to answer them. And so really, I think a lot of these questions that you're going to ask me, I'm going to say, we do not know yet. These are things that we need to work on, things that we're aware of. But these are some of the things that when we sat down, we started asking these questions right away. Water leasing can work if done correctly in the state of Utah. It can work for the benefit of the agricultural producer and the agricultural community, and it can work for the benefit of the environment and the Great Salt Lake. But it needs to be, there's 3 things that they talk about in water leasing, and these are the 3 things that we need to make sure happen as we go down this pathway. Number 1, it needs to be voluntary, okay? Willing seller, willing buyer. You're not going to be able to go in and force a landowner to give up his water rights. That if you want to get caught up in litigation for days, go in and tell a landowner that you're going to take his water rights by force. And you're not going to get a lot of participation, because I'm going to tell you, the ag community, they're all watching their neighbor to see what's happening with their neighbor. And so we just need to enter into this process, and the Department of Agriculture and Food is going to play an integral role in this to say, it's okay. Like, we'll tell you what the deal is. And if you want to walk away, you can walk away at any point. And so we just want to make sure that you understand, here's what water leasing is. If you want to do it, great. If not, that's fine. And it needs to be, a willing buyer too. We need to make sure that the people that are leasing this water are getting what they have and what they expect out of there. What are the agreements going to look like? We'll see. I don't know. They need to be compensated. I talked about this a little bit. How we're going to figure out what that compensation is, I think that that's going to be a debate for another day as well. I think that you do need to make sure, I hear people say all the time, everybody's got to give something to the lake, and I get that. You look at the ag water optimization, the agricultural community understands this as well. You look at the $276 million that's been given to the agricultural community, that's only paying half of the bill. The ag community is expected to put in an additional $276 million. They can only put in so much before they have to start screaming economically and say, I'm running a business. I'm trying to make a living. I'm trying to provide for my family. We need to figure out where that is. We need to make sure that they are fairly compensated for what they are giving up in this agreement. And then the other thing, we need to make sure it's temporary. We don't want to lose the agricultural land that we have in the state of Utah. As I mentioned, it is a finite resource, and it is disappearing day by day by day, and it scares me to death to think that, there's going to be a time when my kids aren't going to be able to go and buy fresh peaches on the Peach Highway up there in Brigham City, that there's going to be a time when the farmer markets are not as prevalent as what they are. You're not going to have the Gosner's cheese or whatever else you've got up there in Cache Valley. How long before they pull out, just like Del Monte did up there in northern Utah? I don't know. But we need to make sure that it is temporary. The term of these leases, I asked Tim, I said, so what is it going to look like? Ideally for us, we were hoping it was going to be a one-year contract, but you talk to water rights, and you talk to Teresa, and you talk to Blake, they're like, this is going to be a pretty a tricky thing to be able to figure out these agreements and figure out what you're going to do with these water rights. It's going to take a year just to put the agreement in place potentially. So these leases are probably going to be for a little bit longer, but we don't want to lose them on a permanent basis. The other thing too is crops can still be grown and harvested on that land. It is not fallowed. Okay, if a farmer decides that he wants to do seasonal leasing and he's not going to irrigate it for one moment, I've told you, you can do alfalfa on dry land. It'll work. You're probably not going to get your 4 and 5 cuttings like you had before, but it is possible. There's other crops there. You've got your safflower, you've got your winter wheat, your spring wheat. You've got all these other crops that you could potentially put there. They could still plant those and harvest it and never irrigate and still be compensated financially for being able to run that piece of property. Water leasing is not the first time in the state of Utah where farmers have been paid not to produce crops. I'm sure many of you have heard of the CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program, where they were trying to get the commodity market under wraps a little bit more, trying to get it under control. Back in the 80s, there were people that were planting wheat in places where there probably should have never been wheat planted. I always drive over the Valley View and I look at fields that were historically cropped for wheat, and I think, I don't know who was driving that combine on that land, but they deserve the Medal of Honor because it's on a steep slope, but wheat prices were so high that they needed to find a way to be able to get those commodities down, and the CRP program was the way to be able to do that. So it's been done in the past, but when CRP, similar to this, they needed to make sure that that land was still covered. The other reasons why it's a benefit for water leasing, why it's a benefit to the agricultural community, it is a competitive market. Okay, it's driven through that competitive market, and it can provide agricultural producers with another potential source of income. It'll give the producers potential to diversify their operation. You talk to a lot of producers that have land that is maybe not so, and I think I talk about this a little bit later, but as we've talked to agricultural producers, they say, well, I've got 40 acres that has been a pain in the butt to irrigate. It's never been really productive for me. If I've got somebody that's willing to lease that water from me for a year or 2 years, I think I'm open to it. I mean, the ag community is not saying hell no, like a lot of people think. They're very open-minded and they're very willing to come to the table because they're seeing the benefits for this as well. It can help producers be more resilient through times of drought. If you know the drought's coming and you know it's going to be rough, you've got two routes. You go and get crop insurance, and you hope that that crop insurance is going to work and it's not super catastrophic. Or maybe the answer is you lease your water, and that's going to help cover some of the offsets of what you're going to see during that drought season. And then the other thing that's beneficial, each lease has got to be done on a case-by-case basis. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. Here's the contract. All we're going to switch is the signatory lines here. It's going to have to be a process where we sit down with each producer individually and figure that out. Once again, some producers have that farmland that's never really been productive. Let's say that you've got a wet spring like this year. You've got several producers that, she's getting ready to hold up my sign, I think, that says I'm running out of time. But so a lot of producers that would be willing, 1 minute. Holy, I get 5. I get 5 because you didn't show me the 5 minute before. Okay. But anyway, you get a lot of producers that maybe you want to use saved water or producers that have a wet spring like this that maybe aren't going to need to irrigate their first crop of alfalfa. And so maybe they see an opportunity to be able to turn that water down as well. So I talked to Tim Davis, and these are some numbers that gave me really quick on leasing and what the leasing environment looks like currently in the state of Utah. The current funding that's available for leasing agricultural water, there's $25 million from the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust that's going to be made available for water leasing here in the Great Salt Lake Watershed. There's $16 million that's going to the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, so $41 million total that's going to be focused on doing split seasonal or seasonal leasing for here in the Great Salt Lake Watershed. He said, according to a study done by the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust, it will cost around $150 to $185 million to lease 100,000 acre feet for the lake. And surprisingly enough, he said this is still cheaper than purchasing those water rights on a permanent basis. So really the take-home message, we do feel like water leasing is a viable option here in the state of Utah. We are sitting at the table right now with our partners. We are willing to promote the program at the Department of Agriculture and Food. We think that this is a way to get additional water to the lake. It seems like every interview that I give for the media, they say, what would you tell the general public about the Department of Agriculture and Food? And I will tell you this, like I understand that right now we've got our rag full of water and we are wringing that water out for everything that we can get, but there is a bend but don't break clause. We need to take a look at the cost and the benefit of what we've got, and we need to make sure that we do it responsibly. And so we appreciate that we're at the table. You know, the question came up, does the agricultural community feel attacked? The meetings that I sit in with the partners that we've got, never once have I felt like we were getting attacked by the partners that were sitting at the table. Do we have a differentiation of opinions? Definitely. There's times that I don't agree with what some of the other people are saying. There's times that we don't agree with what we're saying, but at no point have I ever felt hostility. It's just a simple coming together, trying to figure things out. How is the ag community going to work to be able to make this here? We are willing to work. We value the Great Salt Lake. You look at Joel Ferry, one of the bigger ag producers up there in the Corinne area. Ask me if that guy likes the Great Salt Lake, if he loves the Great Salt Lake. The answer is going to be yes, he does. And I think that you're going to find that a lot of ag producers feel the same way about the Great Salt Lake, and we realize that we have a part to play in it, and we're happy to be a part of it. So that's really all I would have to say. So. Do I have time for one question? Make it good. All right. Oh, wait.
With going to the just 2-crop method, how would that affect the nutrition in the alfalfa for our protein supply coming from the world of agriculture?
This is why I brought Hannah Freeze. Hannah, do you know the answer to this?
It would probably drop it a little bit.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much.
Give you better time cues. And the mic, you got to talk right into it as best you can. Thank you. Thanks. I might need my
Then I can see. Thank you. I'm Marcelle Shoop. I have two roles. I'm the director of the Saline Lakes Program for National Audubon Society's Saline Lakes Program, and I'm also, if I step closer. Oh. Got it? Okay, thanks. I'm also the executive director for the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. And so I'm wearing two hats, but today I'm here on behalf of the trust, very excited to join you. 2 years ago at the Great Salt Lake Issues Forum, I had the opportunity to be joined up here by a couple of our partners, Ted Balling from Rio Tinto Kennecott and Rachel Mussel from Central Utah Water Conservancy District. We were talking about two important water transactions, donations for Great Salt Lake. These were the first water transactions testing the concept, can you put water to beneficial use in Great Salt Lake? And the answer to that was yes, you could. Those transactions were done under authorities of the Division of Wildlife and Utah Water Law. And since that time, we've had an expansion of tools to be able to put water to use at Great Salt Lake, including the in-stream flow laws that you have heard about this morning. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about the next generation, what came of that proof of concept, and where we're at with the trust. I was actually going to show you that while I talked about that, but thanks Scott Baxter, who has amazing photos of Great Salt Lake and birds. So just as a reminder, in 2022, then Speaker Wilson sponsored legislation for the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Program. That provided $40 million to set up a water trust for Great Salt Lake. The focus of that was largely to provide and improve water quantity and quality for the lake, but also to restore and protect wetlands to ensure that there was that hydrologic benefit and retain that ecosystem function. The Act requires that the trust set up with this funding provides significant in-kind or monetary match. There are extensive reporting requirements, and the program is administered by the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. So, although I know most of you know this, National Audubon Society Saline Lakes Program, the Nature Conservancy in Utah, joined together in an application to receive that grant of $40 million. We were successful in 2022, and by 2023, we had set up the trust. We co-manage that. We have an executive committee with representatives from each of the organizations. And then we've partnered with the Community Foundation of Utah. That organization is the fiduciary that holds the trust funds provided by the state, as well as private dollars that come in to support the work of the trust. We have a number of staff that work for the trust. Many of them are Audubon staff. We have one full-time person you're going to hear from right after me, and I'll let him introduce himself, and other part-time staff both in our organization, Audubon, as well as with the Nature Conservancy. We have a trust advisory council that was established by legislation. It has 9 members representing 9 categories: agriculture, aquaculture, mineral industry, water conservancy districts, wastewater treatment facilities, as well as a private landowner near the lake, and 3 different types of organizations that have conservation interests. We have to say that this Trust Advisory Council has been very, very important and very, very successful in our work to date. And I'm happy to see at least 3 or 4 members of that council here today. That's pretty exciting because I know how busy they are. The council provides advice to the trust and to Audubon and TNC, just generally in terms of helping us achieve our mission and goals. But also, when we have a major project of $250,000 or more, it requires approval from the Trust Advisory Council for us to proceed. That's been very helpful, and we're excited to continue that relationship. The vision and mission of the trust actually recognizes the fact that The trust itself was not set up to solve the problems of Great Salt Lake. We're one tool, and in a way, it's a more proof of concept of what can be done to bring water voluntarily to Great Salt Lake and to protect the lake and the wetlands. We have many opportunities listed in the statute explaining how the monies can be spent, but we tend to bucket them in 4 categories: protecting and enhancing water flows to benefit quantity and quality, the protection and restoration of wetlands and habitat to benefit hydrology, focusing on water distribution and management, because we have to have a way to get this water to the lake when we do a transaction, and then broadening our engagement with many different interest groups and leveraging that funding to achieve that significant match. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where we stood at the end of 2023 when our first report to the government was due. We reported that we had water transactions of approximately 64,000 acre feet on a diversion basis. That included some 21,000 acre feet of water permanent. And so most of that water, not all of it, but most of that came from the generous donation made by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then we have three major water transactions, two that I've already mentioned, Rio Tinto Kennecott and Central Utah Water Conservancy District, but also a 12,000 acre foot multi-year donation from the Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District. Last year, we also tried some seasonal lease, or I won't call them seasonal, I guess they were just for 1 year. That included about 2,400 acre feet. We were based in Water Conservancy District to help us get that water to Willard Spur. And then we also had another transaction with Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District for some 7,200 acre feet. It was part of a multi-year fixed time change application. The approval for that came after the irrigation season ended, so we weren't able to deliver that water to the lake, but we hope that that is renewed again this year. So we're starting out 2024 with approximately 54,000 acre feet of water in the bucket of water transactions that are done voluntarily for the lake. And we have to say that, I think we all know this, we can't do this work, nobody can do this work for Great Salt Lake without partnerships and willingness on a part of everybody to do what they can. And when we do a water transaction, every one of the water transactions we've done have either been, the beneficial user of that water is either the Division of Wildlife Resources or the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, or both of them. And it wasn't until the in-stream flow laws were changed that Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands also became one of the parties that we coordinated with on these change applications for the lake. And then the rest of the organizations you see here, I think I've already talked about. When you think about 64,000 acre feet in the scheme of the water demands for Great Salt Lake, for some people it seems like a lot, especially when you talk to other people who are doing water trusts or water funds. But in any event, if you looked at the data that Jake Sarago gave me, it represents about 4% of the estimated average annual flow over the last 5 years. So that gives you a sense of the volume. And the other important thing is working with these partners. Last year we finalized 8 water transaction agreements, 5 change applications, not all of them were completed. And part of the effort that we're doing is actually continuing to prove the concept. So it's really important to test out how these change applications are going to work. They've evolved a little bit since our first one. And then it gives us ideas of how we can proceed. And importantly, and I'll talk about this more when I get to water distribution, is also thinking about how we move the water. And we're not physically moving the water, mind you. Let the state engineer's office do that, or at least monitor it. So let me just talk quickly about our funding and leverage. So our efforts started when we received the grant, but we weren't formally established until January of 23. But we, as of the end of 2023, about $1.6 million of the trust monies had been spent. About half of that were related to water transactions. We also, in the category of leveraging that funding, have approximately a little over $3 million in leverage funding. We, most of that comes from water donations, so we've valued 1 year's worth of water donations, but we've also contributed significantly both in terms of in-kind and cash contributions from National Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy and the Division of Wildlife and others. So at the end of the year, where did we stand in terms of dollars? Well, if you look at our financial reports, which are on our website, we have $40 million in the trust fund, and so you kind of go, how's that? Well, let's just say that interest rates have been good, number one. And then number two, that doesn't mean we have $40 million left to spend. We have already committed over $14 million, $10 million for wetlands transactions or wetlands projects as required by the legislation, as well as $2 million for an endowment and other commitments that we've made in water transactions. So we're looking at, going forward, about $25.9 million. So the other thing that we worked on over the last year is developing a 5-year strategy. So where do we want to be in 5 years? The strategy also is posted on our website, but I'm going to focus on 4 of the very measurable objectives, one of which is by 2028 or in the year 2028 that we would have water transactions of 100,000 acre feet per year, and that would build on our existing water transactions. So we, as I said, we're starting off this year with 54,000 acre feet, so we're looking at another 46,000 acre feet of water. We would like to contribute to and help protect and restore at least 20,000 acres of wetlands and associated habitat around Great Salt Lake. And then we have a big focus on helping to identify water distribution bottlenecks and contribute to improving them, and then continuing to leverage the money that has been provided by the state. That said, $25 million is not going to get us there. We know that we have a funding gap. And Jim, I'm sorry, but I think you got early numbers from the commissioner in your slide presentation. The numbers that we've refined currently are about $110 million to $145 million, both for water and wetlands projects. And that does include some estimate, mostly leasing, but some estimation for if you had permanent acquisitions, but we were just trying to get a handle. And so part of the idea is that this is based on what we know now, but as we move forward, we will continue to reassess that as we acquire more leases or transactions and reassess the dollars that are needed to achieve the goals. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was water distribution and management. You've heard a lot about that today, and I think it's really helpful to be hearing from a number of speakers talking about this. One of the things that we've learned over the last 2 years, actually, with most of our water transactions so far having been in the Jordan River system, is that there are lots of complexities to how water moves, and if you look at the lower Jordan River system, there are many pathways for how the water might get to Great Salt Lake. And I don't know if I can do this. We'll try. Can you still hear me? One way is through the Jordan River to all the canals that go into Farmington Bay and some of the wetlands and New State Duck Club over here. Other ways are through the Surplus and the Goggin or out the west side duck clubs. And so there are a number of ways for the water to get there. So as part of our goals, we're trying to make sure that if we're transacting water, that we have a way to ensure that water is getting to the lake and have a way to measure it. So as we heard from Jim, all of this is a work in progress, and I think we're making rapid progress. We're excited that we've been working with the Division of Water Rights this past year, and I really have to give a shout out to Cole Panter and his colleagues for helping to develop a Jordan River model that looks at all the water rights in the Jordan River system, the seniority, what the water deliveries are, where the water is being delivered. And actually, the report from the Lower Jordan River Commissioner this year did show that all the transactions that have been approved by the State Engineer's Office at the end of 2023 had been delivered to the Lower Jordan system, either out to Farmington Bay or out to Gilbert Bay. It's my understanding that this distribution model will be continued to be refined, and eventually people will be able to just go to the State Engineer's website and see what water has been transacted for Great Salt Lake and how much is getting there. So that's going to be a great improvement. We're excited about that. We also, and I want to thank Eileen Lukens for allowing me to borrow this slide from the gap assessment that USU is doing with the Division of Water Rights. We've worked with them, as well as many others, to identify opportunities where new gauging can be put in place. Additionally, though, the gauges aren't enough to resolve all the bottlenecks. There are lots of issues, lots of jurisdictions or lots of government agencies that have responsibilities in the Jordan River system in Lower Jordan, and that coordination is important, but some of the infrastructure is really outdated, and without those improvements, it's hard to have flexible water management. Some of the issues are as simple as trash buildup that inhibits water movement into the lake. And so we've been working with SWCA to do stakeholder interviews to identify what those improvements could be to remove those bottlenecks. So we continue to think about that. In other places, we're looking at water transactions as well. And when we think about water distribution, anytime we get a lot of calls about people interested in leasing water, in addition to finding out and doing our due diligence in terms of the water rate, one of the second questions, or actually it's also some of the first, is how would we move that water to the lake? And so figuring that out is something we think about a lot. We don't always think about it in terms of a straight shot down a river. We think about what other water infrastructure is in the place, and can we do a trade with an owner of that water infrastructure, an owner of a reservoir, just thinking about more creative ways to move that water. So that is something that we will continue to do as part of our implementation of our 5-year strategy. And again, everything that we're doing is in coordination with a number of partners, many of whom are state agencies. So speaking of partners, one of the other big efforts that we're working on is continuing to build and strengthen our partnerships. So of course, we work closely with the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office. The goals that the trust has set are being incorporated into the Commissioner's strategic plan. And we want to make sure that we're well coordinated and not duplicating efforts. And so we look forward to continuing that effort as the Commissioner strives to address those additional water needs for Great Salt Lake, both in its 5-year and 10-year plan. We also will continue to work closely with the Department of Natural Resources, many of the agencies there, and I won't go into detail there, but we just do. And then, as you probably noticed, that many of the transactions we've done so far have really been with water conservancy districts or private industry, and municipalities. They have large blocks of water that they're not using right now, and so it's an opportunity for us to work with them. We want to continue to do that. They also have infrastructure, pumping rights, many opportunities to help us move water. And then I really want to talk about agriculture and irrigation, and I'm really pleased with what I've heard from Hannah today talking about return flows for the lake. Part of our conservation strategy is to do what we can to make sure that return flows from agriculture that are moving to the lake can remain, if possible. That's really important. That's as important, we think, as also trying to find ways to do these seasonal leases or split season leasing, or work with farmers or irrigation companies that are doing some type of agricultural optimization. So we look forward to trying to pilot some more of those efforts in the coming years, and hopefully by the time next year rolls around, we'll have some more to talk about, and actually I think an opportunity to walk through how some of these transactions work. Finally, let me just say that we know that there are many communities around Great Salt Lake that are impacted by what happens at Great Salt Lake. We also know that there are many tribes that have an interest in Great Salt Lake, and so as part of our strategy, whether it's Audubon or TNC working as our own organizations or through the trust, we want to continue to build on those relationships, and we will continue to do so, and we've had some productive exchanges already, but there's more to do. So just in closing really quickly, where are we headed from here? We are really focused on taking actions to implement our 5-year strategy, which really means a lot more water transactions in particular, and then working with agriculture as part of that. And we use the term adaptive management, recognizing that, this is, as Jim said, a work in progress. So we will continue those efforts and look forward to updating you. I highly recommend that if you want more information on, what are our criteria for water transactions, what's our financial report, what does the water strategy say, please go to our water site, which is GSLWatertrust.org. Thank you. Oh, no questions? Okay, thank you. I'm around if you want to ask me anything. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adam Wickline. I'm the aforementioned full-time employee on the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. I'm the senior project manager, and I'm going to talk specifically about our wetland funding opportunity we hosted last year, and talk a little bit about the projects that will be funded by me. And I'll just set a disclaimer now that I'm not the project manager of those projects, so I'll speak about them high level, but I can't answer specific questions about what will be happening on the ground. But before we do that, I just wanted to lead off. When Lynn asked me to come speak, I was thinking, I don't know if this community knows me as well as other folks in this group. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about my personal connection to the lake. And I'm scrolling through my phone and looking at some cool pictures I got. My first job when I moved to Utah in 2017 was working with John Luft at the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program, which gave me the opportunity to do just a lot of cool things outside and get a lot of cool pictures on my phone. So this is a picture from an aerial survey of looking south from Promontory Point. Just gorgeous resource we have there. I got to do a lot of crazy things, go out to the North Arm, float on the pink water with Jim on the boat. I got to hike all around Gunnison Island when there used to be pelicans nesting out there, working the trail cams. I also spent a lot of time outside doing lawn care for the ecosystem program, the ecosystem project's facilities. And speaking about agriculture in the Weber Valley, one day this herd of goats just rolled through while I was mowing the lawn. I thought it was a fairly unique thing, and I thought that was kind of fun, so I had to put that on there. It also gave me the opportunity to explore the wetlands around Great Salt Lake, particularly on airboats, and get a lot of great experiences out there. We assisted the wetland managers on their banding efforts. This is us going out banding geese. Here's a funny picture of John Neal holding a cute little baby gosling that I just had to throw in there. But again, it was that visceral connection to the wetlands that I really experienced. This is us doing bird surveys in Farmington Bay, and this is open water, but if you can see, and it might be really hard from your seats, there are some tornadoes of midges rising from the wetlands out there. And that speaks to that protein factory that we always talk about with the lake and its wetlands. It's not only the brine shrimp and the brine flies, it's also these wetlands that are producing huge amounts of proteins for our migratory birds, and it's such an important part of the ecosystem. I'm also lucky that Marcelle went before me to kind of introduce the trust and how it operates, so I can talk specifically about our statutory obligation to protect and or restore wetlands and habitat that benefit Great Salt Lake hydrology. I don't know why they did that. So yeah, no less than 25% of the money should be used for that mission. And again, I'm going to reiterate, it all has to be tied to the hydrology of the lake. And without that connection, it's hard for us to justify the work that we do on wetlands. Just for a timeline on how quick, we talk about these new tools that are coming out and it's hard to get things going, and that is also true, but I also want to recognize how fast the trust has worked before I even came on board. I joined the trust in July of 2023. So the trust was formed January 1 of 2023, and by May, June, the Trust Advisory Council and Marcelle and her team, the executive committee, they had all established the criteria for getting this wetland funding out the door. In July 16, we announced the funding. September, we closed the applications. We reviewed those applications in September and October, and then announced awards in November and worked on contracting. And I'm happy to say that all but 2 are contracted right now for our wetland projects. We were talking earlier about this is the Super Bowl of Great Salt Lake, and who would you have on your team? I think these are the people I'd have on my team because they were gracious enough to give their time to help us review the applications because they have the technical know-how to understand what the benefits of these projects will be and how to rank them and compare them to each other. So many of these people are in the audience, so I just want to say thank you for your time, for helping us work through this process and get some great projects on the ground. These were the criteria we used to evaluate these applications, and I just want to again emphasize that the hydrologic benefit to Great Salt Lake is the highest scoring category we have out there. I don't know why that does that, and I'm sorry. But anyway, that's where you could get the most points in your application, as well as ecosystem and wildlife benefits. So we wanted to see both of those things together. And then the other part I'll call out is the matching funds. And Marcelle spoke about our obligation to leverage this funding into more funding. And so our requirement was that at least 25% of the project had to come from outside funds. And I'm happy to report that we achieved that in spades. So at the end of the day, we ended up awarding 8 projects with funding for a total of $8.5 million committed from the trust and a matching contributions of $6.5 million. So again, we beat that 25% requirement pretty well, which is great for us. One of the projects is on permanent protection of wetlands. So, and I'll speak about that in a little bit. And then the other 7 were all about enhancement and or infrastructure projects that are going to benefit wetlands and the hydrology. And the acreage we identified that will benefit is 13,127. So we're on the way to that 20,000 acre goal that Marcelle talked about for our 5-year strategy. We were also happy that we got great geographic coverage for the wetlands around Great Salt Lake. Sorry, West Desert, wetlands over there, we're not really helping, but the majority of them were in the Farmington Bay region, but we did reach out into Ogden and the Bear River Delta as well. So I'm going to go through these projects one by one and talk a little bit about their benefits. And again, I'll just reiterate that I am not the project manager, so I can't answer specific questions about these. So the first one I'll talk about is this monitoring and quantification of GSL inflows from Bear River. So this was put forth by the Fish and Wildlife Service, our friends at the refuge. They want to understand inflows from the Bear River into the refuge and outflows from the refuge. Let's see if I can. So the last USGS gauge on Bear River is right here at Corinne, and they want to understand between that gauge and the refuge and its impoundments down here, how much water is still in the system. So that's synoptic, thank you. That synoptic study's going on right now to better understand how much water is actually reaching all the infrastructure in the refuge, so that the refuge is going to be able to better call on its water rights eventually. And this ties into what Therese was talking about earlier too, of more measurement further down the system, better understand deliveries. They're also going to better understand outflows. So the one gauge that Teresa spoke about is out here at the end of the L line, where water's coming into Bear River Bay here. But this project's going to better understand water coming into Willard Spur and Bear River Bay from these areas. So not only is that going to benefit the wetlands by better understanding the water's coming in, it's also going to benefit the trust to understand how water is moving out of the refuge into the lake itself. Next, the Division of Wildlife Resources is just recently acquired this property. It's an old duck hunting club just west of the airport. And it had fallen into disrepair. The wetlands were not well maintained, so they applied for funding through us to upgrade and install these water control structures. It's probably hard to see, but there's red dots all around the property so that the managers can create more high-quality habitat. And as I understand it, this property will eventually be a WMA with public access capability. So we're really excited about that one. The next four I'm going to talk about were all submitted by Ducks Unlimited. The first three are in the Farmington Bay region, and a lot of them are very infrastructure-heavy water control projects. So this first one is to improve water control structures along the bypass canal, which these red stars are the water control structures, and it's kind of hard to see that blue line is the bypass canal. And it's aptly named the bypass canal because it allows the wetland managers to bypass their units and put more water into the bypass canal and put it into the unimpounded areas of Great Salt Lake. So we were out there last week, and those structures are extremely unsafe, and I was worried for Dave England's life as I watched him try to show how he put boards in and out, and we look forward to upgrading those and giving those managers better control over water in their impoundments and give them more ability to move water out. Next, the Ducks Unlimited are going to upgrade the State Canal Dam and the Burnham Dam, which are two structures down here. This relates to that slide that Marcelle showed with all those branching ways that water gets from the Jordan River into Farmington Bay. This is another upgrade to that infrastructure, giving those managers more ability to move water where they want it to go and move water into the lake through the State Canal, through the bypass canal when we have flooding situations and we need to get water into the lake as quick as we can. And then the last one from Ducks in the Farmington Bay region, same thing, upgrading two other structures in the New State Duck Club. These ones deal with the sewage canal, which is another big pathway for water. Again, giving those managers more ability to dump water into the sewer canal and get it out to the lake. And then the last one from Ducks, they moved out of Farmington Bay, they moved up to Ogden Bay. There's two big efforts that are going to go on in this project. One is resurrecting a wetland unit that had been heavily damaged in the 1980s floods. This dike around here was completely, it lost all control. So that'll be reconstituted with these stars here as water control structures so that the managers can let water out fast if, good Lord willing, the lake rises up and we get more flooding, they could move water in and out and reduce damage to that dike. So that improved water control, they're going to be able to make the habitat in Unit 2 more viable for wetland production. They're also going to be able to control water a lot better from going into the unimpounded areas of Ogden Bay. And that's going to give Keith Hombrecht and his folks at Forestry, Fire, and State Lands more ability to control the frag that's growing out of control below the water control structure. They're also going to update the South Run dike, that other purple line here that's heavily degraded and puts this unit at risk from breaking open and losing all its water control. Next, the Nature Conservancy, their project at the Great Shorelines Preserve, they're going to do a ton by installing water control structures, levees, and BDAs, which I thought was really interesting. That BDAs, it makes sense. They would work just as well down in the watershed as they do up in the watershed. Again, they're going to create these. They're going to create more ponded wetlands, open water habitats, and return that hydrologic connection between water that's coming into the shoreline preserve and water that's going to flow out into the unimpounded areas. So these were the 7 enhancement projects. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the protection project. And you all probably know that working in land protection, conservation easements, this is where we talk about big dollar stuff. So all these other benefit to acreage, dollar spent for benefit per acre is nice, but protecting land costs a lot more. But we're excited to work on this. So Salt Lake City put forth this proposal to protect 200 acres of wetlands. It's this funny looking L shape here that is currently zoned for industrial development, but the city is going to acquire that land, put an easement on it, and then ensure those wetlands are not developed. There's also it's called the Rudy Drain property because Rudy Drain is a water conveyance that comes through the property and feeds all these duck clubs that are below. So by protecting that little piece of land, we're going to protect the waters that are flowing into those wetlands and eventually into the lake. Okay, this last slide, I'm going to try and talk through as best I can, but I think hopefully it makes sense to everyone. So Marcelle talked about our goals, right? And the goals of the trust. So we have protect and restore wetlands to benefit hydrology. We have protect and retain and enhance water flows to Great Salt Lake and improve the water distribution and management. So I tried to look at all the benefits coming through our project and kind of categorize them and put them in this Venn diagram appropriately. Some of these things will, like placing a wetland in a conservation easement or optimizing wetland habitat for wildlife production, fall squarely in that protect, restore wetlands bucket. But others, like invasive species control or frag control, also retain and enhance those water flows because as we reduce the frag infestation in these areas, we're going to reduce the evapotranspiration happening from those plants, thus more water is going to make it to the lake. So that's a double count for us, right? It's better for wetlands to have less frag. It's also better for water reaching the lake. And same with those protected flows, like I talked about with the Rudy Drain. Ensuring that development doesn't disturb that flow, we ensure or protect that flow, making its way downhill into wetlands and eventually Great Salt Lake. And then in the sweet spot in the middle of the Venn diagram, we have improved water conveyance. And a lot of these projects, I think I've said water control structure probably 100 times in the past 16 minutes. So all that improved water conveyance is improving that distribution system, giving managers more options for moving water around. And Marcelle spoke about that, being creative and how we move water into the system. And it also benefits those wetlands by giving wetland managers more capacity to draw down units or fill units depending on what they need, as well as get more flow to the lake if we're protecting those canals that are going to the lake. And then this last piece, this monitoring, like the Bear River project is almost exclusively monitoring. And I forgot to mention that all the Ducks Unlimited projects, they're going to put gauges everywhere we saw a star on those maps. So we're going to increase the gauging, increase our ability to understand water movement, and that's going to benefit the trust's actions like Marcelle talked about as we try to get more water transactions going. So that was I tried to be on time. I haven't gotten the flash yet, have I? Oh, have I? Did I miss it? But I will finish with that and also state that, like Marcelle said, if you want more information, a lot of this stuff is online. So please go to our website and you can dive deep on the wetland projects and look more at our criteria. And I'm around if you have questions.
One after another, or are you going to
Yeah.
sit up here and talk too?
Oh, no, let's just go in sequence.
Okay.
And then we'll do the questions at the end.
Deal.
Nobody wants to have anything to do with these microphones.
They've changed the batteries, so they should be a little better. But good call, better safe. Okay, and here's your clicker if you'd like.
All right. All right, good afternoon. I'm Hugh Hurlow from the Utah Geological Survey. Groundwater has been identified as a major knowledge gap in the whole Great Salt Lake water budget and solute budget system. And so in one effort to help address this, the University of Utah Department of Geology and Geophysics and the Utah Geological Survey and the U.S. Geological Survey are collaborating on a study to investigate more detail about groundwater inflow to Great Salt Lake. So today what we'll do in our session is split the time among 3 people, myself and 2 grad students from the University of Utah who are working on this project, Eben and Sam. And I'll start off with a very basic and generalized overview of the physical hydrogeology of groundwater flow to Great Salt Lake. There's a whole nother realm of the chemistry implications of groundwater flow to Great Salt Lake that I'll barely touch on, but could be another talk in itself, but I'm avoiding that. And then Eben and Sam will get into more detail about what they've been studying and some preliminary results from our work. All right. Let's see. All righty. So I'll try to move along here and do 3 kind of quick sections. These are generalized. There's a lot more detail to be thought about here, but I'll try to keep myself going at a good pace. So I'll start with some overview of kind of the big scale picture of groundwater flow to Great Salt Lake. There. All right. This is from a regional groundwater flow model by the U.S. Geological Survey, published in 2011. The full model stretches from Las Vegas to Logan. I'm sure there's a country and western song buried in there somewhere. But I've highlighted the Great Salt Lake area, and you can see that they've subdivided this area into what they call a regional groundwater flow system. So at some large length and time scale, it's felt that groundwater is connected throughout these basins and eventually flows towards where it discharges at Great Salt Lake, either through groundwater surface water connections or as groundwater. So this is the regional scale of groundwater connection to Great Salt Lake. And in yellow are what are considered groundwater discharge areas. This is where groundwater is moving up through the aquifers toward the surface. And so either discharges at the surface or creates shallow groundwater conditions that are supported by groundwater flow. So it's a regional scale problem that largely coincides with the surface watershed. I'm very grateful to Kyle Davis for loaning me this slide. He's working on the current U.S. Geological Survey regional groundwater flow model. And the boundary here shows the physical boundary of that model. And it encompasses, as I said, most but not all of the watershed that is the focus of all of the other main studies. But this is the modeled groundwater recharge distribution in the Great Salt Lake groundwater basin. And the reds are areas of low but present groundwater recharge. So there are recharge in those areas, and then the relative amount of long-term annual average groundwater recharge increases as you go toward blue. So not surprisingly, the higher recharge rates are in the Bear River Range and along the Wasatch Front. But there is groundwater recharge in all the mountain ranges throughout the lake, or around the lake. So if you compare that, you have the recharges mostly in the mountains and the discharge areas in those yellow areas I saw, which are more in the lowlands immediately surrounding Great Salt Lake. Do it that way. Just a few more details about groundwater flow. On the left is a map of groundwater levels in Salt Lake Valley that compiled by a UGS study. This is a kind of a aggregated 2010s groundwater level map. The groundwater levels decrease from the mountain fronts toward the valley, and again decrease from the valley toward the Great Salt Lake. And groundwater flow tends to follow that decrease in groundwater levels based on difference in gravitational potential of the water at the different elevations, approximately perpendicular to the contours, which are just lines of equal groundwater elevation in the shallow basin fill aquifer. So you have this picture of groundwater flow from the range boundaries or the mountain front toward the valley center, and then up north to northwest toward Great Salt Lake. And that was borne out on the right-hand slide, which is based on a study from the University of Utah, dating time since recharge of groundwater in the basin fill aquifer along the alluvial fan and grading down in toward the Jordan River in the valley. And the time since recharge increases very systematically from the mountain front to the basin center. So that just reinforces this concept of the groundwater flow patterns. In more detail, this is a conceptual model of how groundwater moves from the recharge areas to the discharge areas. It's based on a study of Salt Lake Valley by Sue Thuros of the U.S. Geological Survey, and I've kind of added some things to it, and I won't, this is where I have to be disciplined, and I won't go into too much detail, but you can see, you can conceptually divide the area into 3 zones: primary recharge zone on the mountain front, secondary recharge area, and a discharge area. And we know the least about the discharge area, and that's the focus of the study that we're engaged with in the 3 parties, the U of U and USGS and us, which I'll get to in a few minutes. In short, most groundwater recharge to aquifers occurs right along the mountain front. This is where there are a lot of coarse-grained sediments shed off the mountains and deposited by the rivers. And so groundwater can infiltrate down to the water table pretty easily there. And also the streams lose their water as they enter the valleys right at that point. And so the groundwater can travel down into the basin fill aquifer and flow toward Great Salt Lake. Below the secondary recharge area, clay-rich sedimentary deposits, mostly deposited in the various Pleistocene lake cycles and earlier lake cycles, split the aquifer into 2 components: an upper shallow unconfined aquifer and a lower confined aquifer. Okay, so you can start to differentiate 2 aquifer systems at least in that area And there's some important differences there. In the shallow groundwater aquifer, that water is the water that interacts with streams, either through gaining or losing processes. So there's a groundwater, surface water connection in that zone. Also, that is the groundwater that supports wetlands along the stream and further down adjacent to Great Salt Lake. That water is also potentially vulnerable to contamination because of its presence just in the shallow subsurface. And then in the deep aquifer, the water mostly just moves deeply and slowly toward Great Salt Lake, and we know it's coming upward in the discharge zone, but really that's kind of a big frontier on the groundwater flow patterns around Great Salt Lake. What is it? What are those processes? And that's what we're trying to study. This is a compilation. Looks like we got some formatting issues there. Sorry about that. This is a compilation of some select groundwater level records in wells monitored by the U.S. Geological Survey. Should have had a map here, but West Point is off west of Ogden. Centerville is along the east shore, and then there's a well in North Salt Lake Valley. So you can see there's a common theme there of long-term declines at various rates since 1980. Okay, much less in that well I picked in northern Salt Lake Valley, and not every well shows these exact patterns, but you can see there's a periodicity, a fluctuation of groundwater levels over time superposed on an overall approximately linear decline. And it's that decline, if you were at the talk by the strike team this morning, a loss in storage of aquifers was mentioned. And that is calculated from or reflects these long-term declining groundwater levels. That reflects a loss in storage of the aquifers. Okay, so this next part, and so this brings up a bunch of kind of important questions that we don't know how to answer right now that I've listed there. And I'm almost out of time. So I'm going to skip through this quickly. It just led me to co-plot the Great Salt Lake levels and the groundwater level hydrographs. And there's kind of a strange coincidence there. This is very basic stuff. It's not supported by statistics or any further analysis. But the fact that they follow the same pattern might suggest that there's a common larger stressor involved. And I'll just move on from that. And based on time, I'm going to keep going. To preview Sam and Eben's talks, where we're really focusing on more detailed processes of groundwater flow to Farmington Bay. It's involved a lot of different studies, notably drilling of core, or collection of core of the upper sediments and installation of groundwater monitoring wells at the pink dots so far shown on the map on the left. We started with a conceptual model. There was a basic observation that there's a highly saline layer perched at the top of the playa. But if you go just a little bit to the east, there's pretty fresh groundwater moving toward the lake. So the interaction of those two systems is what we're focusing on, and why is that saline layer there, and what are its dynamics? And this just kind of shows, this is very schematic. It kind of shows the kind of data we're collecting and how we're trying to synthesize it. So on the left is really basic results from the coring, and you can see there's 3 discrete clay layers in there and a mix of other lithologies, and that influences the groundwater flow and groundwater levels. Next over is a profile of pore water salinity that Sam and Eben did on the core, which shows a spike in salinity and a gradual decay of that downward. And then on the far right is a schematic of the monitoring wells that we've installed, and it shows that the groundwater levels in the deeper wells are higher, which indicates an upward hydraulic gradient a tendency for the groundwater to flow upward and discharge toward the lake, but we still don't know where or how or what rate that discharge occurs. All right. So I think I'll just go ahead and get out of the way for the grad students. I just wanted to point out, here's Locomotive Springs in the north part of the basin. And I did a study in Curlew Valley, which is just up gradient from these springs a long time ago. And Lynn asked me to talk at one of these forums, and I kind of declined because I was like, well, what's the relationship? What's the point? Anyway, these are a poster child of springs that have been highly impacted by groundwater pumping. So we may be returning to them sometime. Okay, thanks. Next up is Ebenezer Adamako-Mensah, one of the grad students I'm working with.
So for Kaiser, I use this one.
That's the laser, yeah.
That's Leasing.
You can use that for click right for advancing the slides too. And then can you talk right into it really loud?
Hi, everyone. My name is Eben Adamako-Mensah. I'm a master's student at the University of Utah at the Geology and Geophysics department. Today, I'll be talking about the work that I've been doing together with UGS and USGS on estimating groundwater inflows to the Great Salt Lake. I'm kind of tall, so it's kind of struggling here. So as Hugh mentioned, the main objective of this project is to improve our understanding of total groundwater that is entering the lake, and then in future help us to be able to provide more accurate estimates of groundwater in our water budget. For a little bit of background, I think Hugh has already talked about this. We know groundwater comes from the mountains and then flows laterally from high elevation and then discharges at some point here, low elevation, that's wetlands, and then finally into the lake. This work is focused at Farmington Bay, the east shore of Great Salt Lake. The location map shows sites. This green pin shows sites where we have installed monitoring wells. These are at our Antelope Island Causeway site. And then the blue pin shows the sites at our Southern Transit site. The red pin shows sites that we plan to install future monitoring wells. So to zoom in, our first site at the Antelope Island Causeway is about 0.25 miles from the toll booth. So this is our easternmost site, and then our westernmost site is about 5.1 miles from the toll booth. And then we have our Southern Transit site, which is about 0.3 kilometers from the South Davis sewage treatment plant. And then our westernmost site over here, which is 2.4 kilometers from the South Davis treatment plant. I forgot to talk about these spots here. Interesting round spots that we saw in areas of Farmington Bay that we perceive to be areas of groundwater discharge. In order to be able to understand the complex groundwater flow at Farmington Bay, monitoring wells of various depths were installed. So the schematic shows various groundwater monitoring wells at different depths ranging from 5 feet to 110 feet. The photo on my left shows nested monitoring wells at our southern transect, 0.3, which is our easternmost site. And then the photo on my right shows nested monitoring wells at our Antelope Island Causeway 1, which is our easternmost site. To be able to understand and then calculate discharge, we have to be able to understand the direction of flow. So we've observed upward gradients, and then we've seen that the deeper wells have very high upward gradients, and then this indicates an upward flow. So the picture over there, it's me. We tried adding an extender to a 100-foot well, and then the well overflowed the extender in about 30 minutes. So this indicates that the deep wells that we have very high hydraulic heads, and then as such, very high upward gradients. This is a very funny animation that I did just to show our flowing wells. So most of the deep wells are flowing, that we have like water coming up above the casing. And then this is seen at almost all the sites that we have, with the exception of our westernmost site at Antelope Island Causeway. We've observed that we have high upward gradients in the deeper wells, and then the flowing wells are the deeper wells, as I mentioned earlier. To be able to calculate the discharge, Darcy's law was used. For Darcy's, we use the equation, which is given here. Specific discharge is directly proportional to K, which is hydraulic conductivity, and then your hydraulic gradient. So K controls the permeability of a porous media. That is how easy or how difficult water flows through your media. And then the hydraulic gradient, it's the difference in head measurements between your shallower well and then your deepest well. So just to give you a sense, K for gravel, it's 1,000 meters per day, and then K for clay, it's 0.01 meters per day. So I'll come back and then compare the K values that I had from my slag test to the K values that we have here to have a sense of how less our values are. So to be able to get our K, we have to do a slag test. The diagram shows a simple description of how a slag test is done. You start by measuring your known static water level, and then you use a slag, in this case, a water pump, to displace or remove your water. And then as you pull your slag or as you pull your pump out, you quickly start to measure the rise in water with time. And then since our wells are open at the bottom to the formation, water will move from the formation through the well. So you measure the rise in water with respect with time, and then that gives you your hydraulic conductivity. So just a summary of the K values. For our westernmost site at AIC4, which is about 5.1 miles from the toll booth, the K values that we had range from values of 8.5 to the -4 to 1.2 to the -3. And then the K values that we had for AIC1, which is our easternmost site here, ranges from 1.2 to the -2 to 1.2 to to the -1. So I use this average K values to calculate specific discharge using the Darcy's law that I showed previously. And then the specific discharge that I had for the westernmost site is 1.34 to the -4 meters per day, and then 3.13 to the -2 per day. And then this gives us a sense that we have more discharge at the periphery compared to our westernmost site. And then that is what we expected, because realize that the K values here is quite bigger compared to the K values here, in the sense that we have more like silty layers here, and then we have very fine clay here. So this is the most interesting part. I want to ask a quick question. What do you think the salinity will look like at the Antelope Island Causeway as we move from surface below? Do you think it's going to increase or decrease or stay the same? What do you think will happen? Okay, so this is very interesting and then surprising. We realize that salinity tends to decrease as you move down. And then right below 30 feet, it even gets very fresh. So we have very high salinity values above 30 feet, and then as you move below 30 feet, it gets very fresh. And this is surprising because we didn't expect to see this kind of profile before we started this project. So this is very interesting and then surprising to see. There's the next question I want to ask. I think there's one, the answer kind of showed on the screen. So I want to ask in terms of spatially. So we have our easternmost site here, and then this is AIC1, this is AIC4, and it is AIC3. So in terms of spatially, how do you think salinity is going to perform? Is it going to increase as you move from east to west, or is it going to decrease? Increase. Okay, so that's what's happening. So you realize that salinity tends to increase as you move from our first site, that is the easternmost site, and then as you get to our westernmost site. And then this is explained by these ones being the close proximity to the lake, and then the seasonal indentation of the lake towards the side. In conclusion, our initial observations from the research that I've done so far, it's been observed that we have upward gradients, and then these upward gradients tend to be very higher in our flowing wells. And then we also have the deeper wells being the wells that are flowing. And then our specific discharge is largely controlled by the low K values, which tends to restrict the total groundwater that we see being discharged to the surface. And then it's also been observed from our salinity profiles that salinity decreases with depth. And then this, we believe that it's happening as a result of upward flow of groundwater, which is kind of restricting the downward diffusion of the soils. And then the flowing water that is coming up, we believe should discharge at some point into or closer to the lake. But these are points that we've not yet found, and we're still trying to install more wells, put in more seepage meters to be able to identify those sites. So lastly, what I did was compare the specific discharge values that I calculated with average ET for April. If you look at the value, you realize that that's not much difference between ET and then the specific discharge. And then this tends to agree to the fact that we are not being able to record or observe much discharge or groundwater coming to the surface. Thank you.
to advance, or you can click on these arrows.
Try to talk into the mic as best you can.
Thanks.
Can you guys hear me all right? We should have structured these talks in terms of increasing height. Would have been a little easier. All right, so my name's Sam Carter. I'm a master's student at the University of Utah, working under Kip Solomon. Today I'll be talking to you about understanding groundwater inflow to Farmington Bay using environmental tracers. So obviously my work is very related to Eben's and Hugh's. I just hope to add a slightly different perspective using environmental tracers, which is kind of using the chemistry instead of the physical parameters, which we'll talk about in a second. So again, not going to spend a lot of time here because Hugh and Eben already talked about it, but I do want to emphasize that just further south of Great Salt Lake, right, we have lots of evidence of substantial groundwater recharge to the Salt Lake Valley system. In this case, the Jordan River, right? This is a kind of an older paper, but 140,000 acre feet per year, right? That's a lot of water. So, you know, try and think about what would happen if we just kind of shift this a little bit further north, you know, adjacent to Great Salt Lake. What would we expect to see, right? So this is kind of our, again, these guys kind of touched on this a little bit too, but this was our conceptual model before the study started. You know, the difference in this study area, right, is we have a huge saline body of water, right? So would we expect to see, this is kind of what you see at the ocean, right, where you have denser salt water hanging out below freshwater, and you have this freshwater saltwater interface, and perhaps all of our fresh groundwater from the mountain block is, you know, flowing towards Great Salt Lake and hitting that interface and discharging on the Playa margins. However, yeah, that's not what a lot of our preliminary data has shown. Eben and Hugh kind of talked about the salinity profiles, number 2 there, and our upward hydraulic gradients. We've also done some geophysics, some electrical resistivity that has all shown that we have water that practically meets drinking water standards 30 feet below Farmington Bay, below Great Salt Lake, which is pretty significant. But, you know, again, echoing, we don't really know a lot of things about the system still, right? We know that we have lots of groundwater, presumably, that's discharging somewhere near Great Salt Lake, but we don't really know exactly where that water's coming from, how fast it's moving, and where it's discharging. So hopefully I can convince you that environmental tracers will be a cool tool for trying to understand and conceptualize groundwater inflow. So what are environmental tracers? They're just chemical signatures in our environment that can tell us a little bit about the history of groundwater, right? So I'm going to be focusing on these 3. We have radioactive isotopes. We'll be focusing on tritium here, which is an isotope of hydrogen that decays to helium-3. And an isotope person, you know, will tell you that if you know the parent product and the daughter product and the decay rate, you can calculate an age, right? We'll talk a little bit about what groundwater age means in a moment. Then we have dissolved noble gases. So this has to do with the fact that the solubility of gases into water, or the willingness of gases, you know, if a gas wants to be part of the water or part of the air, right, the solubility depends on temperature. And so temperature is super correlated with elevation, right? So different gases will have different concentrations depending on where that groundwater entered the ground system and where it recharged at. So this is a cool tool of telling us if water came from the mountains or if it came from the lake. And then we have stable isotopes as well that can help us tell about the origin of groundwater as well, depending on, you know, the heavier versus the lighter, whether our sample is more enriched in the heavier isotopes or not. You've heard a little bit already about how salinity has been used as a tracer, and then SF6s, which come from transformers and electrical insulators, and CFCs that come from Freon and refrigerants and stuff like that, will also be used as tracers in this study, but I don't have that data yet, so we'll save that for a later date. So anyways, yeah, tritium to helium-3 dating. So one, you know, what is groundwater age? You might have talked about it a little bit, but when I say groundwater age, I mean the last time that water touched the atmosphere. So, you know, the time starts when the water enters the ground and ends when we sample it. So you'll start to see by looking at this figure that, you know, age is cool and all, but really what it helps us understand is one, groundwater velocity, right? Velocity is just distance over time. So if you have the distance is known between two wells and you have a difference in time, that gives you a velocity. So this is a super powerful tool for understanding how fast groundwater is moving towards Great Salt Lake. You can also start to see that, perhaps you see this little protrusion here where we have kind of younger water creeping out, right? That it took less time for that groundwater right there to make it just as far as water over here. So it kind of can tell us about the spatial relationships of groundwater, right? Maybe tell us where there's highways of faster moving groundwater flow and help us illuminate where that inflow is occurring. Another important facet of this technique is it's independent of hydraulic conductivity. So obviously, Evan talked about that being a huge challenge, right? We don't need to know the hydraulic conductivity, and that's what makes this a really powerful tool. The age is independent of that, and this tells us directly something about the velocity and the flow. So yeah, it's been shown further south in the Salt Lake Valley that groundwater moves about 7.5 years for every mile, or 1.9 feet per day. And just to note, we can't date water older than 85 years with this method. So dissolved gases, like I said, depends on the solubility of water. So it can tell us about the recharge elevation of where that groundwater came from, right? And something to note, this figure again is from the Salt Lake Valley. And notice this is in meters, so sorry for non-scientists out there. But practically all this water in the Salt Lake Valley came from above 6,500 feet, so well into the mountains, right? It didn't recharge via precipitation from the valley floor. It came from the mountain block, which makes sense with our conceptual model. Stable isotopes can also help tell us about the origin of groundwater, right? Let's imagine this is Great Salt Lake, right? All this evaporation that's happening is leaving the heavier isotope, in this case oxygen-18, enriched in Great Salt Lake, whereas the opposite happens in the mountains, right? We have all the heavier stuff drops out beforehand, and we're relatively depleted up high. The one downside of stable isotopes is a lot of the time what happens is groundwater recharges into the mountains, and it, let's say discharges into Little Cottonwood Creek, right? And then hits the valley and goes back into the groundwater system. The stable isotope composition won't change. It won't show the differentiation there, but noble gases will, because that water would re-equilibrate with the atmosphere. So there's different tools here. Again, I won't really talk too much here. Study area is Farmington Bay. Proximity to the mountain block leads us to believe that there's high recharge rates. There's great access via the causeway, and it's exposed at low lake stands. I plan to sample throughout all of Farmington Bay to kind of get a nice spatial relationship picture. However, as of right now, most of my data comes from the northern part here, so that's where we'll focus and we'll dive in. So let's look at some preliminary age data. Already some really interesting trends. Again, only 3 data points here. This is from the deeper confined aquifer that he was talking about. So all these wells are 400 feet, 700 feet, and about 900 feet. So they're all pretty deep. Only 2 data points here, right? But if we did take these 2 data points, already we have an age gradient, right? It took 8 years from groundwater to move from Layton to Clearfield. It's already pretty useful data. This is a really interesting well. This is 430-foot deep well drilled practically through one of the saltiest lakes in the world, right? And it's fresh water, one, so that tells you something about the system. There's groundwater under there. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of helium-4 because we're not going to really talk about it here, but the helium-4 concentration is about 30 times atmospheric, and just by comparison to carbon-14 dated waters, which again we won't get into, but is used for dating older groundwater, this water could be thousands to tens of thousands years old, which is crazy. So zooming in kind of to our installed wells. Yeah, and this kind of gives us more of a, shallower scale here, but gives us kind of a vertical profile of age. So you'll notice that all of our shallow wells have relatively younger water, and all of our deeper wells have water that can't be dated with this technique even. So there's clearly an age gradient already emerging, right? Our noble gas data suggests that all of the deeper wells came from the mountains, so well over 6,500 feet, which isn't surprising, but again, still pretty crazy. This well that is underneath Great Salt Lake has water that could be thousands of years old and came from the mountains. It's just envisioning that history is really interesting. So again, zooming in, our shallower wells do not share that same history. It looks like it equilibrated with the atmosphere at a low elevation and when it was salty. So clearly we have a little bit of, whether it's diffusion or slight downward flow at the surface to our shallower wells. But again, even just 60 feet below the surface of Farmington Bay, we have water that came from the mountains. So the preliminary stable isotope data, this is not as visually appealing, so I apologize, but not all science is pretty. So you've seen this salinity profile right here, salty water at the surface, fresh at depth, like Evan talked about. The oxygen 18 pretty much says the same thing. All the water at depth has a relatively depleted signature, so it came from snowpack, precipitation, whatever you want to call it, and the stuff at the surface looks highly evaporated. So it looks like it came from Great Salt Lake. These are all kind of just reiterating themselves, right? And this is, yet again, another way of looking at it is all you need to know here really is that all water comes from the air, atmosphere, precipitation, should fall kind of on that, all those gray dots right there. That's all local water isotope data. Has a slope of about 7.5. Any deviation from that slope, a shallower slope, would indicate something that has been more evaporated, which is exactly what we see with our shallower wells. So again, kind of just echoing each other. So yeah, let's draw a couple of just preliminary conclusions. One, there are significant groundwater resources underneath Farmington Bay. That's not to say that you could pump out unlimited amounts of water, right? The hydraulic conductivity, again, is super low, whereas over towards the mountain block, it's a lot higher. That's where all of our, city wells are. But there are significant groundwater resources underneath at least this part of Great Salt Lake. All of our deeper wells suggest they came from the mountains, and yeah, they have a high recharge elevation and an old age. All of our shallow wells suggest that they equilibrated with the atmosphere when they were salty and at a low elevation. They're relatively young. And then already we kind of have an age gradient emerging in groundwater moving towards Great Salt Lake, which will be super valuable when we start to try and quantify these things. And then, yeah, we haven't really found the discrete discharge zones yet, right? We don't know exactly what this system looks like yet. Perhaps the majority of our groundwater is discharging along the ply margins, and there's only a little bit of water that's making it out and discharging in Great Salt Lake or underneath Farmington Bay, despite the high upward hydraulic gradients. Or maybe there's huge highways of flow, bigger arrows that discharge out here that we haven't found yet. It's future work, and hopefully these environmental tracers can illuminate some of these things in the future. So, thank you.
We have some time for questions if anybody would like to ask about the mysteries of groundwater with our experts.
Are you going to let these grad students off easy? Come on now.
Hello. So I noticed, I noticed that there was a salinity spike around 50 feet of depth, and I find that very interesting. I'm wondering if anyone could illuminate on that.
Any thoughts? I do. There was only one of those profiles so far has shown that, right? Yeah, a couple of the salinity spikes coincided almost exactly with the presence of discrete clay layers. So I don't know the exact reason, but the clay probably slows down flow in some way or concentrate solutes, something like that. So yeah, again, it seems to be only one of the profiles, but we have a few more that we didn't show and a few more to come, I think. Anything to add? Okay.
So there's been talk about developing a ranch on the west side of the promontory mountain range and then irrigating that for pasture land using wells. Do you think that would have an effect on the level of the Great Salt Lake to put a good-sized ranch out there? Or?
Any additional pumping would capture discharge that would otherwise go to Great Salt Lake. Whether that would be a measurable effect, I couldn't say. It would depend on the magnitude of the pumping.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? On one of your first slides, you had where all the groundwater was coming through Salt Lake Valley. Now, 200 or 300 years ago, was that a lot of wetlands there? And now that Farmington Bay was blocked off from the Great Salt Lake, it's turning into fresh water. So are we actually just replacing the wetlands that used to be in the valley here with wetlands in Farmington Bay?
The second part, I don't know. I haven't looked at historical imagery of Salt Lake Valley, but I can pretty confidently say there would have been much more extensive wetlands associated with the Jordan River, and that's a basic principle in groundwater development and hydrogeology, is that groundwater pumping, when it reaches a certain level, captures discharge toward the surface. So it's both by reducing storage and lowering groundwater levels, and so that water has been captured that otherwise would have gone to wetlands over time. Yeah.
Hi, Hugh.
Hi. Hi.
Hello. So,
what?
All your models kind of cut off Antelope Island to the west. And so what I'm wondering is the water that's coming from the Wasatch and coming out into Farmington Bay, is it backing up against Antelope Island? And is there any flow from Antelope Island precipitation from west to east?
Mm-hmm. Yes and yes. Yeah, we haven't really addressed that yet, have we, in terms of Antelope Island as a hydrogeologic barrier? Well, we think that it is. What role does that have in that kind of impounded salt layer? Although we do have another site at the very north end of Tooele Valley that also has that perch saline layer. But I think that will be, we haven't even drilled the wells there yet, but I think that'll be an interesting contrast where groundwater is flowing toward an open face in that area versus maybe butting up against Antelope Island. And yes, there are springs discharging from Antelope Island.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. My original conceptual model kind of had, hello? That's a huge, essentially bedrock where you have all this basement deposits. And so, it doesn't like me. I think I have seen some tritium data, though, that has suggested that a lot of those springs on the east side of Antelope Island are young water and kind of just shallow flow paths off of Antelope Island. But it would be really awesome to get out there and date those with some other methods and try and understand if there are some bigger springs.
The White Rock Bay wells should capture just recharge coming from Antelope Island. Starting next week, we hope. Okay.
Were you to move out further into the main body of the lake, would the higher salinity and higher density of the water out there suppress the upward movement of the groundwater?
That's a great question. So what we've observed when you move westwards is that we tend to have more clear layers. So we have very low hydraulic conductivities. And then we believe that is what is preventing the upward flow of the groundwater and then keeping the salts at that surface. So we believe that as we move westward towards the Antelope Island, you see that kind of observation.
And more so out in the deeper part of the lake. Yeah, there's a little bit of head above those, the surface.
And that kind of deeper freshwater saltwater interface that I kind of showed as our original maybe conceptual model, it could still be possible more towards the main body of the lake. There is evidence from a well from the Water Rights website on Fremont Island that does see a lot of salinity at around 200 feet, and so maybe that is that deeper freshwater saltwater interface. We don't really know, but yeah, maybe the hydraulic conductivity is so low that for as long as Great Salt Lake's been at its current level, it hasn't had a chance to get too far down. We don't really know.
Get away from these things as fast as we can.
All right, thanks for these great presentations and all those great questions. We're going to take a break until 3:45, so please be back here by then for the rest of our talks for this day. Thank you.